So the question today is, are you getting enough green smileys? And if you don't know how to get more green smileys, stick around because we're going to talk about that on reality coaching for writers. Diana, welcome to the show. Give everybody our tagline and our pitch.
Hey, we offer no fluff, just the real stuff to help you
Yeah,
succeed.
to succeed. That's right. So why don't you kind of introduce this topic about green smileys and really how that impacts it's impacted by the writing of the author itself.
Sure. So when you work with search engines and certain websites like WordPress, they give you green smileys when you have checked all the boxes. And one of the things that constantly presents itself to on one of the websites Eddie and I help edit and manage
Yeah.
is the passive writing. It's constantly writers get pinged for that, and so there's the red smiley, the mean face, the middle orange, okay, and then there's the green, and so it's a great way to highlight this this voice. And so I thought it would be good for us to talk about that today. How do we correct passive writing?
Yeah, and it's I mean I've mentioned this before. It's something I struggle with because my natural inclination is to write in a passive voice. In scripture, a lot of times, you read the Bible a lot and you tend to pick up what's being written in the Bible. A lot of times the scripture is written in a
Yeah,
passive voice. It's a lot of
yeah,
he was giving and they
yeah,
were going and all that kind of stuff. So if you read it enough, you're going to pick up some of those habits.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
and I was thinking about this, and really, in one way, what you're doing is when you're writing in a passive voice, you are allowing someone else to drive the action. That's kind of the bottom line of what this is. Um, so if Scripture says, "And they were going down the road," um, then that implies that something was driving them down the road. I mean, it's not necessarily stated overtly, but rather than they say they walked down the road, which is putting an action verb to what they were doing, they were
Right,
going suggests that, well, we don't know how they were going, we don't know why they were going, and we don't know who was pushing them down the road. It's
right.
so it's a subtle way for the reader to pick up on something that the characters themselves aren't really very active in the story, and that's why part of this dinging for the lack of a smiley face comes in, I think.
Right. And some other examples of passive is the room was cleaned, or the flowers were cut, or the lights were turned on. And when you don't have a attached person to the action, where there's anonymity, where there's, well, who cleaned the room?
Right.
Um, you know, so now sometimes they try to solve that, Eddie, by just saying the room was cleaned by Maria. And they think that solves the passive voice. They've attached a person to it, but that is not, it's still passive because it doesn't tell us anything about Maria. What if
Right.
what if someone said Maria bustled around the room huffing as she cleaned it? Well, we're getting some emotion, something about Maria where it's oh, she's bustling around huffing. She's upset about something. It gives us a clue, and it's like you said, Eddie, it moves the story forward. So it's you don't want to just slap on a band-aid. You want the sentences to uh, bring something to the story.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it is in one sense it really indicates that you are not in the head of your character. So in this case,
Right.
Maria, we're not
Yeah.
in Maria's head. We don't know who she is or what she is. We don't know what she's thinking, and we really don't care. What when you write it in passage, you're saying, "I don't care about Maria." Well, if you don't care, the reader's not going to care about Maria either. She's just a
Exactly.
prop in the story. But
Yeah.
if she is bustling around the room, huffing, yet at least you begin to see a little bit or begin to paint a little bit who she might be. And if she slams the door on the way out, you've got one more thing to know a little bit about Maria, and you may begin to think, maybe she's going to come back. Maybe she's part of the story, right? Which is again,
Mm-hmm.
you've drawn the reader into the story, and they're beginning to bring questions and thoughts to it as well, which is what you want with an active voice. Um,
Right. And this is passive voice shows up in nonfiction and fiction. So
oh,
this topic is for both of writers
yeah,
because yeah, go ahead.
I'm laughing because you're right on a couple of nonfiction projects I've worked on. I mean, that's that was the thing. I finally went back. I said, you've got great content, but dang, everything about this is passive writing. Everything is about it. I said, and what you were doing is basically putting me to sleep with great content. I mean, your content is great. I should be excited about this, but I'm about to fall asleep because it's all was, were, would be, And again, I do this stuff. So, I mean, this is my speck in my eye. And so I see the speck in your eye kind of thing. But yeah,
Yeah.
it happens a lot in nonfiction. I, in one sense, I think it happens sometimes with certain writers because they don't want to offend people. And when you write in a passive voice, you're not making a lot of times a declarative statement. You're leaving things a little bit open ended, like, well, if this is what I think, but you can think something different, if that, something like that. Um,
Exactly.
so it helps to have basically an A-type personality, like I'm right and you're wrong, and right in that voice. I mean,
Well, I constantly remind the nonfiction writers like Coach, you're the expert here.
yeah,
If you're writing on this topic, you're the expert. So don't say, well, I think, or it could be said. No, say it. Say, this is the way you see it. They picked up the book because your name's on it.
yeah,
They picked it up because supposedly you know something they don't know. So don't suppose, would, like you said, Eddie, you're the expert. If you're writing the book on this topic, talk like the expert you are.
yeah. I thought you were going to say talk like the pirate you are, which is, you know, which is what I, which is what I had to remind myself that in the very first pirate
That's
novel I
good.
wrote, because Mary Denman, I sent a early copy to Mary and had her read it, and she said, your character's passive. Everything's happening to Ricky, but Ricky's not doing anything. And I went,
Ooh.
oh, you're right. And Ricky wasn't driving the action because again, I write in a passive voice, and I wasn't really embracing being a pirate. And a subtle way, Mary was saying, be the pirate. Okay, I'll be the pirate. Yeah.
Well, and you said it made a really good point. You said you get bored when there's passive writing, it's boring. Either in nonfiction, there's no challenge, but in fiction, it's the pacing.
Yeah.
You need action to drive the story, like you said, and but the action also moves us from this room to the carriage that's going to take them down to the ball, and where the romantic connection is going to take place. Well, you've got to don't drag that out, because a lot of readers will close the book and they'll never get to the place where you really are having you know a, a main scene take
Yeah.
place that's going to draw your two characters together. If you take too long getting us to that ball, we will check out. We will just check out. So
Yeah.
pacing is so important.
Yeah. Pacing is important, and that's one of the things. There's a truism that John D. McDonnell taught years ago in one of the articles I read. You never tell anybody how to get from point A to point B unless there's a unique way to get from point A to point B that nobody's ever done before and they need to know it. But his point was people know how cars work, trains work, planes work,
Yes.
boats work, and
Yeah.
sidewalks work. So you show them leaving the building and show them walking into the next building that they were going to be to, and skip the stuff in between. And part of what happens, I think, in that telling of how people get there, Diana, is the writer his or herself doesn't know where the story's going, so they're trying to fill in a gap here. And they're not confident in the character. If a cop leaves a crime scene, if he goes and gets in his car, and the next thing you know, tires are screeching up and he's jumping out. Well, he drove there fast, and he probably had the sirens on. That means there's danger of something going on, right? And just all
Right.
that can be condensed into 3 or 4 sentences in a short paragraph, and you've got them from A to B. But that's because you know who the character is. You know the
Mhm.
story and you know the character, so you can say these things. So
Well, and Eddie, we see a lot of this in first drafts because because you're writing and you're actually developing the story as you go. Sometimes you'll have this front matter in there,
yeah,
but in the second draft, you've got to cut it. And I think beginning writers, they they're afraid to cut things, and they fall in love with their words. Stephen King, we quote him often because he has one of the best books on writing, and it's just called Stephen King on Writing.
yeah,
But in it, he talks about killing the little darlings. And in this place where you leave the house and you're on the way to the ball, there might be one sentence in there that you've just fallen in love with. You love that sentence. Honey, you got to cut it because it doesn't serve you
right,
your purpose. And so, yes, in a first draft and in developing the story, because like you said, you're still trying to figure out how it's going to work. Write it all down. You've got to get that down to get the bones, the real bones and the real story there. But you've got to edit those passive things out,
yeah.
and you've got to identify them. And so, what would be an identifier for you, Eddie, that shows, like, is there a word like that? Okay, you named a few. Could,
Yeah,
would.
yeah, you could, would, have, has, all those words you kind of
Yeah.
grab that. So wrapping this up, because we wanted to kind of keep this one short, what's your one takeaway on passive writing? What would be your one takeaway?
Look for sentences that belong to no one, no person,
Yeah,
no, or no thing.
yeah,
Like, you can have a house be a character in your book if the house moans in loneliness, you know, or but still, again, it can't be passive.
yeah. And for me, it's back to what we were talking about just a second ago. Look for words like would, was, First thing
Yeah,
I just search for was, and look for
yeah,
was, and figure out a way to just flip it into an active sentence. And if you can't, look, if you're having trouble figuring this out, use Chat GPT one time and say, look, this is a passive sentence. Tell me how to make it active, and it'll do it, because Chat writes in passive voice. It does. It's by default. So it's going to give you passive
yeah,
writing, and
yeah,
then you just ask it to give it to you in active voice. So, or
yeah.
chat
That's
in
great.
emails. Well, listen, this has been great. I hope it's been helpful, and we'll have another episode of Reality Coaching for Writers soon. Thank you, Diana.